many of us would like to aim for in a whole variety of our periods of our academic life. So I'd like you to welcome, as he comes up to use this microphone, Dr. N.T. Wright, the Bishop of Durham, to assure him of the warmth of our welcome to him and his wife, and to say how much we're looking forward to hearing about the historical Jesus.
Speaking as a radical, conservative, liberal, charismatic, I'm a little alarmed to hear that Alana and Rob too had a dream. I mean, I'm not sure what happens when two people have the same dream. There's something very biblical about that, I suspect. But we Anglicans have a story about the clergyman who dreamed he was preaching a sermon and woke up to find it was true. And I have this anxiety because I'm suffering from jet lag, and it might just happen tonight, so if I nod off, just slip away quietly and leave me to snore. But I hope that I won't go to sleep, and I hope you won't either, because tonight's subject is, of course, very central to the whole business of Christian faith. Although that claim itself is controversial in some circles. When I was in Jerusalem in 1989 working on an early draft of the book that became Jesus and the Victory of God, 6 or 7 years later, it took longer in gestation than I imagined. It was more like an elephant having a baby than like a human, if you see what I mean. Although actually that's an interesting point in itself when you think of the size of the book, but there we are. I was staying in St George's College, and the Dean of St George's Cathedral, who was my host, who's a godly, quite old-fashioned Anglo-Catholic priest, I think he wouldn't mind me saying that, he said, "What are you writing about?" And I said, "The historical Jesus." And he smiled and said, "Oh, well, I suppose, yes, that may be of interest to some people, but of course the real thing is the Jesus that we know when we pray and when we celebrate the sacraments." And I thought, bother, he's just undermined my whole project with a neat sweep of the theological hand. But of course it isn't only conservative Catholics who say that. Many conservative evangelicals would say it as well, that actually history is damaging to faith, if not positively dangerous. And even such a great luminary as C.S. Lewis in his Screwtape Letters. Lewis devotes an entire letter in the Screwtape Letters to the rubbishing of the quest for the historical Jesus. Lewis, of course, grew up under the shadow of Albert Schweitzer and other people who'd written books like that. And he says that when historians go after Jesus, they make him quirky, they make him a crank. And in fact, the Jesus that we know is the one who the church has always preached about, and so on. And again, I want to say sorry, with the greatest respect, and Lewis is one of my middle to high ranking heroes, I actually think he got it radically wrong at that point. History is necessary when we look at Jesus because faith itself demands it. The Christian faith which says that Jesus was fully human as well as fully divine. If he really was fully human, if we really take that seriously, we cannot shirk the historical task. We cannot assume that we know precisely who this human Jesus was. And we are promised, when we look at John, or when we look at Paul, or when we look at Hebrews, that it is when we see Jesus more clearly as the human being he was, that we discover what the word God actually means. Classic Christology does not assume a meaning for the word God and then fit Jesus into that. It looks long and lovingly at Jesus and then says we need to rethink what we mean by God around that fixed point. And in fact, the church has often been rather bad at doing that. And the church, in reading the Gospels, has often emasculated them and has often shrunk the vision of Jesus to something that it can cope with, or that it thinks it can cope with. Of course, the real Jesus frequently elbows his way out of our rather confining liturgies and lectionaries and structures and little systems and lets himself be heard again. Thank God he does that. But again and again, when I've been talking to Christian groups, large and small, right wing, left wing, high, low, whatever, I find that the Jesus they have just doesn't quite match up to the Jesus that really is in the Gospels, but they've forgotten about. One of my research assistants a few years ago, facing the challenge from one of his friends that what I was doing was actually undermining the biblical witness to Jesus, he said, no, what you're doing for them is giving them the biblical Jesus they didn't know they had. Well, that's what I pray I may do a bit. I don't claim I've got it all right, far be me from it. I used to tell my students in Oxford that up to 1/3 of what I was saying was seriously flawed, the only problem being I didn't know which third it was. Because if I did, I'd do something about it. Because in every other aspect of my life, at least 1/3 of what I do is seriously flawed, and somebody, usually the lady sitting down here on my left, informs me in no uncertain terms of it. But within the intellectual life, it's a little harder. So we need correction. We need to hear from one another. And part of the point of the historical task is that it's done in public and that we can ask one another, how then do you read this text? What do you do with this piece of evidence? How can you say this when Mark says such and such? And so on, and so on, and so on. That's how it's supposed to work.